So welcome, ciao everybody. Why are we here today? We're here today because of a knowledge gap as well as a practical implementation gap in the marketplace. What do I mean by that? So 84% of small business state they have a good relationship with their customers, but 41% of those small businesses can't measure that relationship. So this research provides kind of a means for those companies to address that gap. And again, above and beyond simply just happy or sad. Agenda for today: introductions on the C.A.F.E framework. So the C.A.F.E framework really is a measurement tool, again, of customer and company relationship strength and sustainability. It represents committed, ambiguous, fragile, and elusive relationships. And again, relationships influence liking, preference, spend, and longevity with the company. So again, critical for success for small business. My background is in business administration, marketing, 30 years in the marketing space, about 20 plus years in CRM. So as you can imagine, the theme of this research is, again, customer relationships. And again, the relationship being the connectivity between these two potential groups. If you look at the state of relationships today, I ran a quick exploratory last year. Probably not a surprise, almost like an 80-20. But again, a good majority believe they maintain a relationship with a company. Of those that do, 76% feel those products have improved versus those that don't maintain a relationship. Likelihood to recommend is very high versus those that don't maintain a relationship. And then finally, continuity also is potentially high versus those that don't maintain a relationship. So the observations on relationships are they can influence perceptions, of course, impact likelihood to recommend, as well as encourage longevity with a company. So again, measurement and management of these relationships is critical. What gets measured gets managed. One of my favorite quotes from Ridgway. So the objective of the thesis, 3 objectives. 1 is to develop a measuring framework. 2 is to look at the dimensions of that measurement. And then finally, to generate question and answer surveys for customers and companies to create this kind of dual perspective score. So if you look at the KPIs today, the key performance indicators, the majority are really descriptive and outcome metrics. What they don't necessarily address is above and beyond just are they happy or they sad, but really what's under the hood, right? So what are the potential issues that could be impacting this relationship? So the research questions we wanted to look at is how do you conceptualize this? How do you create this dual perspective framework? And of course, how do you classify those relationships? So as far as literature review was concerned, we looked at over 110 studies. And again, the majority of the theory was around social exchange, okay, the reciprocation, recognition between, if you will, two parties in a strength standpoint, in an effective standpoint, in a calculative standpoint, if you will, to impact those relationships. And if you look at the current frameworks, the majority of them are very one-sided in perspective, right? It's either customer perspective maybe or firm capabilities. But I like to kind of joke sometimes in relationship marketing, it takes 2 to tango. So the idea being it is both. It's not just one or the other in a relationship. It takes 2 to tango. So the C.A.F.E framework is the opportunity to look at a dual perspective approach, if you will, to measurement. So the building blocks for the relationship strength and sustainability, we looked at really narrowed down to 6 dimensions that we thought were mission critical. First is trust. Integrity, trusting that the company will take care of me or have my interests in mind. Overall satisfaction, of course, from a customer and company perspective. Commitment for ongoing engagement, obviously, with the company or the small business. Resilience, ability to withstand shocks. So if there's unintended consequences or problems, how do I as a customer or I as a company manage that? Perceived value, kind of the net more rational approach to what is the benefit cost of this relationship. And then finally, really co-creation, the ability to work together or feel that I'm involved with this company in their production. So if you look at the data and methodology, we use surveys. For the customer survey, they rolled up to, of course, trust, commitment, satisfaction, perceived value, resilience, and value co-creation, as well as loyalty indicators. So I wanted to add a couple extra questions that we could use, obviously, for our filtering or our impact scoring. And then for the audit for the company, 15 questions, again, rolling to trust, commitment, satisfaction, perceived value, resilience, and value co-creation. And we ran validity and reliability. So we ran content validity with other academics as far as these dimensions were concerned, ran a C.A.F.E as far as their variance, and then finally reliability as well on the scale questions, the constructs. So as far as the panel members, we had a good debate and discussion again on the importance of dimensions and potentially which was considered more important or less important. Ran a C.A.F.E on the questions for the customer, and again, they were above threshold for the average variance extracted, as well as the composite reliability, and the company questions as well, both passed the threshold, in addition to the reliability of the questions. So Cronbach's alpha on the customer as well as the company both scored. So then it was a question of weighting those dimensions as far as important. So from the customer perspective, we felt really satisfaction was the deepest indicator as far as longevity was concerned. So that was weighted, if you will, as the highest. But for small business, actually trust was deemed the most important. The structure, the foundation to which all employees and the company could perform would be mission critical, if you will, to that relationship. So as far as the framework was concerned, again, it was combining customer and small business with a slight weighting towards customer being the greatest arbiter, if you will, to the ongoing relationship. And so as far as content and results were concerned, on the customer standpoint, we had scores from 2.2 to 6.4. And again, here are the averages. And on the small business side, again, scoring from 2.8 to 6.5 with the averages. And as far as the C.A.F.E scores, right, when you combine these two together, again, the scores were 2.4 to 6.2, so here were the averages. And as far as thresholds, so we looked at how we would score these potential thresholds, and committed we determined it being 80%. And this was really kind of found out, by the idea of the tipping point at 80%, obviously from a satisfaction standpoint, from a net promoter score standpoint, of course, that's the threshold, but also the zone of satisfaction. So 80 was kind of set at that tip point. Ambiguous in the middle. So again, indifferent. Potential inertia in those relationships, down to fragile, which was more problematic. These were potentially seeking to defect or to move to other products or services. And then finally, elusive were kind of at the bottom, very small, potentially transactional in relationships, and not in any way laddering, if you will, to relationship. So if you put the results together, this was the kind of the example of the dual perspective. And again, we saw about 47% in committed. But again, 53% are in risk states of a relationship with a potential company and a customer. So from a discussion standpoint, key findings, a measurement tool. Secondly is the neutral paradox. A third was a measurement gap. And then finally, perception gaps. So the measurement tool was really the ability, if you will, to score your customers in these buckets, right? The ability to actually measure relationship strength and sustainability. The neutral paradox was a little bit more concerning, or somewhat unexpected. So again, we had the scores, if you will, from a good relationship versus neutral from the customer standpoint. The greatest dimension actually was resilience. But actually, value co-creation was the largest delta difference, which was curious. And again, from a net promoter score, we also saw a decline from good to neutral, as would be expected. Now, this might look like it's a linear difference between good and neutral, right, from a C.A.F.E score as well as net promoter score. But if you mapped out NPS with C.A.F.E, what we saw is if the customer wasn't giving you a 10, like a committed 10, there was a lot of relationship volatility below 10. If somebody was scoring you a 10, there was a much higher stability on that relationship score. So again, the key learning, or the interesting aspect is, if you don't have a committed NPS score, there's a lot of volatility potentially in that relationship. The measurement gap, of course, as we mentioned earlier, the 41% of small businesses that don't have the scoring in place, those that do have scoring basically have a higher rating as far as customer scoring is concerned. Also, a higher scoring on first contact resolution. So the ability to use a score improves these two measures. And then finally, really perception gaps. And again, between customer and small business, there was gaps, and again, also across all of the dimensions. And they were basically highlighted, resilience being the greatest. And again, I think more of a challenge for small business to manage the execution of shocks, if you will, to the consumer on unintended or unplanned events, of course. Commitment, again, potentially on loyalty or longevity reciprocation platforms from the small business. Co-creation also being a gap. Perceived value, again, it's actually interesting. The consumers definitely rated perceived value generally higher than potentially what the company would rate. Satisfaction, a little bit of a misalignment, but trust was actually the lowest. So this was good to feel that both customers and companies have a good sense, if you will, on integrity, if you will, with the companies. So as far as research limitations were concerned, obviously the size and scope of the surveys, longitudinal validation, this was kind of a snapshot in time. again, limits that this was kind of a dual perspective, but not necessarily truly dyadic. So again, if you were a company, you'd want to look at your customer results versus your company's and kind of measure that. Again, limited negative extremes. So we had good and neutral, and not a lot of the bad relationships. And again, that could be related, of course, to survivor bias in these potential surveys. But again, if you look at the conclusion and final academic goal, so again, we were trying to look at a theory, a gap, in addition to a practical scoring gap. So the three objectives were the framework, the dimensions, of course, and then the question answers. So as far as the framework was concerned, we developed this C.A.F.E framework, so that was accomplished. We were looking at the dimensions. Again, we picked the 6/7 for customer dimensions, and then finally generated those question answers for small businesses to use to actually make the scoring. So all three objectives were accomplished. So contribution basically being theoretical, again, looking at sustainability and potentially forward-looking opportunities, especially from a committed standpoint. Dual perspective being very different from just one-sided measurement of that relationship, but also the fact of looking at linear challenges, especially with Net Promoter Score between good and neutral, as I mentioned, if it's below 10 versus 10, and impacts on the company. And then practical contributions, of course, as far as diagnostics, how are you in your relationship strength and sustainability, potential resource allocation of those funds, early warning. Again, some operational spots, like we talked about resilience and maybe some commitment gaps that small business are going to work on, segment-specific strategies, of course, infrastructure, and then finally, really cost to implement and not being significantly high if you use like a SurveyMonkey or something similar. So future research could definitely be kind of focused on longitudinal, right? Not just a snapshot in time, but again, what impact do these scores have over time, right? So is there migration between potential segments or other? What are the causal mechanisms? So looking at the 6 dimensions, again, is there preceding causation correlation with some of those factors, and how do they change? And then again, interventions, right? So can you intervene in fragile or elusive and kind of change that perspective? So those would be areas, I think, for future research. And on a closing note, again, it takes 2 to tango. So again, dual perspective is, I think, mission critical for many companies. Thank you for your time.